A few days ago, I made a video attacking the argument for Islam from the literary excellence of the Quran, and somebody decided to try and respond to those arguments, and it's that response that I'll be addressing in this video. Heads up, this is going to be pretty long. Now, my opponent begins by addressing the parody arguments I put forward, such as Eminem being the best rapper, Gordon Ramsay being the best at making beef Wellington, things like that, and he asserts that these aren't analogous. He begins by saying that none of these people claim to be a prophet, but so what? Are you saying that if Stradivarius had simply claimed to be a prophet, then the uniqueness of his violins would be evidence that they are from God? If that's your argument, that seems like a pretty ridiculous symmetry breaker, but let's keep going. He then says that they did nothing miraculous, but hold up, that's question begging. The entire point of the literary excellence argument is that the Quran is miraculous in virtue of the fact that it can't be duplicated. By that same reasoning, Stradivarius arguably did do something miraculous in his creation of his violins. If the literary excellence argument is sufficient to call the Quran miraculous, then it should be sufficient to call Stradivarius's violins miraculous. But maybe what my opponent means is that these people didn't do anything miraculous outside of the objects in question. For instance, Eminem never raised a man from the dead. Well, if he means it in this sense, he has a problem, as Muhammad didn't do anything miraculous either, and the Quran explicitly says as much. We see again and again throughout the Quran that the public was demanding miracles from Muhammad, and that Allah was saying no miracles would come because he is just a warner, and that past people didn't listen to miracles. See Surah 29:50, 13:7, and 17:59. My opponent then proceeds to present an incredibly contrived framework to explain what constitutes a prophetic sign. And the reason he does this is he has to in order for the Quran to count as a miracle. Here's what I propose a miracle or prophetic sign is. It is an event that cannot be plausibly explained or brought about apart from supernatural intervention. That's it. When Moses threw down his stick and it turned into a snake, that was a sign because apart from supernatural intervention, when sticks are thrown down, they don't turn into snakes. And everybody who has ever touched a stick knows this. When Jesus raised people from the dead, this was a sign because shouting at dead people to get up does not suddenly make them alive again apart from supernatural intervention. And you don't have to have any advanced medical knowledge to recognize this. Now, if we take this simple, basic understanding of a miracle and we apply it to the Quran and we ask, are the literary qualities found in the Quran only able to be explained by supernatural intervention? The answer to that is clearly no. It is bonkers to suggest that the only way these words could be arranged in this order is if God himself did it. Now, I'm sure at this point you're thinking, well, how did this illiterate guy produce such great poetry? And to this I say, my friend, you don't have to be able to read in order to compose or recite poetry. So even if I granted that everything written in the Quran originated from Muhammad, which I don't, you couldn't just cite his illiteracy as if that somehow prevents him from hearing other poets and learning from them. My opponent then says that all the parodies I brought forth were nothing more than subjective aesthetic perception. And yeah, that's the point. You grasp the issue here. When you hear me say that Eminem's raps are the best, therefore they are from God, you think that's ridiculous because that's just subjective aesthetic perception. That is exactly what everybody is trying to get Muslims who are making this argument to understand. Your argument is just as subjective. And even if you try to shift and say that you're not referring to aesthetics, you're referring to, I don't know, rhetorical knowledge or rhetorical power or something like that, it's still going to have this issue. I think the rhetorical structure and power of Paul's letters is better than the Quran. Am I wrong on that? If so, by what standard? Some weird, contrived standard that Muslims have invented to try to justify their claim? My opponent then goes on to talk about how prominent poetry was in Arabian society. And yeah, you're actually hurting your case here and leading credence to my point that Muhammad could have composed poetry despite being illiterate. If Muhammad is living in a society in which poetry is very common and it's praised and it's a cultural talent that could bring him power and prestige, it really doesn't seem that far-fetched to think that a young illiterate man hearing poetry in the streets or from others would start to try and compose some of his own. You don't have to be able to write to compose poetry, and if poetry is commonly performed orally in your society, you wouldn't need to be able to read in order to learn about poetic arrangement. Now, my opponent says that nobody was able to meet this challenge, but who is the judge of that? Who gets to decide whether the challenge is met? If you set up the rules of the game and then you make yourself the judge, it's really not that impressive if you declare yourself the winner. You say that if only they had produced something like it, it would be over, but that's assuming that Muhammad was operating in good faith, and he would have just gone home if somebody had produced a surah like it. He would just be like, oh yeah, you got me, kid. I guess I'm not from God. Good one. Like, no. Who judges whether or not a surah like it is produced? That's the central question here. This is supposed to be a challenge to convince guys like me. So if you say I'm wrong when I sincerely say I think I found something better, like, okay, you can say that, but that's not convincing. My opponent then asserts that everybody just recognized how Muhammad was the best guy to ever drop a beat, but this is not even what the Quran tells us their response was. Surah 8:31, when our signs are rehearsed to them, they say, we have heard this before. If we wished, we could say words like these. These are nothing but tales of the ancients. It doesn't seem like everybody was super impressed by Muhammad's claims. Now, my opponent then posts a picture of text in which a guy describes himself as being the best poet. Cool, just because he thought he was the best poet doesn't mean he actually was. The fact that some poets thought Muhammad's album was fire didn't mean all of them did. In fact, we know from Muslim sources outside the Quran that there were multiple poets who mocked Muhammad and that he got them killed. So at this point, your argument is essentially some of the poets of Muhammad's time thought the Quran was the best, therefore it's from God. Moving forward, my opponent cites some scholars who say that the Quran is great, but in doing so, he misrepresents my claim. I never claimed that all scholars outside the Muslim bubble would be bashing it. That would be an insane claim. I think a good many scholars sincerely believe the Quran is a great piece of literary work. I merely noted that it's not uncommon to also hear the dissenting view. Because these scholars are cited as a straw man attack, I'm fine to recognize them and say, yeah, cool. I will note that Ali Dashti, who I quoted in my original video, notes on page 48 of his book that early Muslim scholars such as Ibrahim al-Nazm, Ibn Hazm, and al-Qayyat openly acknowledged that the arrangement and syntax of the Quran are not miraculous, and that works of equal or greater value could be produced by other God-fearing persons. Similarly, Shadi Nasser, who is a professor of Islamic studies at Harvard, when asked about whether the Quran was miraculously unique in its style, he said no, it was not miraculously unique, and that not all Muslim scholars thought the style of the Quran was miraculous, and that this concept developed over time. He says that many Arabic scholars don't think the Quran is stylistically superior to other compositions, and he notes that there are linguistic or grammatical problems in the Quran. He also says the exact same thing I am saying regarding subjectivity in regard to the superiority of styles, and that there is no objective criteria to say that one verse from one poem is better than another. All of this was said in a YouTube interview titled The Truth About the Quran, which is easily accessible to this day. Now, there's a lot more that could be said on this topic, but I'll conclude with this. When Jesus was questioned on his authority, his evidence was to heal cripples, give sight to the blind, and bring the dead back to life. When Muhammad is questioned on his authority, his response is to say, yeah, well, I have the best poetry. This speaks volumes about the men in question.